Noble rank in medieval Europe came with power. It also came with cost. A lord was expected to maintain horses, equip soldiers, repair fortifications, host his peers, and pay dues to those above him. These were not occasional demands. They were the permanent requirements of holding his position. The income that sustained these obligations came almost entirely from the land, rents, dues, and the revenues of the manor. That income was seasonal, dependent on harvest, and slow to arrive. The gap between what lordship cost and what the land reliably produced was a structural feature of medieval noble life. When that gap became too wide, the consequences reached far beyond the lord himself. The financial obligations of a medieval lord were not occasional. They were continuous, layered, and largely fixed. The most visible was military. A lord owed mounted, equipped knights to his overlord during campaigns. War horses were expensive to acquire and to maintain. Armor required regular repair and replacement. A knight who arrived inadequately equipped was not merely a personal embarrassment, he was a visible signal that his lord's resources were under strain. The household made equally constant demands. A functioning hall required servants, retainers, and steady expenditure on food and provisions. But the household was also a political instrument. When a lord received guests, neighboring nobles, royal officials, church dignitaries, the quality of that hospitality communicated his standing directly. A diminished table was not a private inconvenience. In a world where power was as much performed as exercised, it was a public statement. Upward in the feudal hierarchy, a lord owed his own overlord financial contributions at defined moments. An aid toward a ransom, dues at inheritance, a contribution toward a daughter's marriage. These were not requests. They were legally enforceable obligations rooted in feudal custom. The physical estate required continuous investment as well. Castle walls needed upkeep. Roads, drainage systems, and mills had to be maintained. Where local chapels or church buildings fell within a lord's patronage, their maintenance was his responsibility. Against all of this, a lord's income was almost entirely land-derived rents, manorial dues, and the revenues from various customary rights. It arrived slowly and seasonally, in amounts that could not be quickly increased. A poor harvest, disease among livestock, or a period of armed conflict could sharply reduce that income while leaving every obligation unchanged. This was the structural imbalance at the center of lordship. Expenditure was fixed, public, and continuous. Income was variable, slow, and uncertain. When income fell short of obligation, a lord needed to find capital elsewhere. Selling land outright was rarely straightforward. Land was not simply property. It was bound to lineage, inheritance, custom, and feudal obligation. Disposing of it often required the consent of an overlord and carried social costs that could themselves damage a lord's position. Lords needed other means of accessing immediate funds without permanently surrendering territory. Across much of Western Europe, Jewish moneylenders were a primary source of credit. They operated under royal license. The king authorized their lending and took a share of the revenues they generated. Because Christian canon law formally prohibited charging interest, Jewish lenders filled a gap that the credit economy required. They were not marginal figures. They were embedded in the financial system, tolerated because they performed a function that others formally could not. Loans were typically secured against specific income streams, the revenues of a mill, a market, or a toll road, transferred to the creditor for a fixed period until the debt was settled. Italian merchant families and banking firms from Florence, Siena, and Lucca provided credit at a larger scale. Working through letters of credit and formal commercial instruments, their networks stretched across Europe and offered access to more sophisticated financial arrangements. Lords also borrowed from wealthier peers or from ecclesiastical institutions. Monasteries sometimes held significant capital and entered into lending arrangements secured against land revenues dealings that operated within the boundaries of what canon law permitted. The prohibition on usury shaped all of these transactions. Charging interest was formally condemned. In practice, it was built into the structure of the loan. The recorded repayment sum was written larger than the amount advanced, with no explicit rate stated. This was understood on both sides. It allowed the credit economy to function within limits that religious doctrine had established. To illustrate how such an arrangement might have appeared in practice, a lord approaches a creditor to negotiate terms. He offers the revenue from a market held twice yearly on his lands as security. A sum is advanced. A repayment period is agreed. The income from the market transfers in the interim. The document records a debt. The interest appears nowhere by name. Both parties understand precisely what has been arranged. Debt, once contracted, did not remain static. When a lord could no longer meet his payments, deterioration followed a recognizable sequence. The first stage was a liquidity crisis. The lord could no longer meet immediate obligations on time wages to soldiers, dues owed to his overlord, payments to craftsmen working on his estate. This was not yet visible public collapse. But those immediately around him knew. Delay was readable. The second stage was household contraction. Retainers began to leave. Loyalty in this world was conditional on payment and realistic prospects. As men departed, the hall grew quieter. Fewer horses, fewer men at table, fewer servants in attendance. In a society where the vitality of a household communicated power directly, this shrinkage was not a private matter. It was a political signal, visible to vassals, neighbors, and rivals. The third stage brought concessions. The lord began transferring revenue rights to creditors in exchange for immediate cash. Toll rights, milling rights, fishing rights, market rights. Land had not yet been surrendered, but income streams were leaving. Each transfer provided short-term relief while reducing the income available to meet future obligations. The structural problem deepened with every transaction. The fourth stage was jurisdictional erosion. As rights and revenues passed to other hands, the lord's practical authority over portions of his own manor began to fragment. Other parties now held enforceable claims on his land. His capacity to govern, to adjudicate disputes, enforce customary practice, and present a unified legal identity was progressively compromised. None of these stages was private. Each was legible to everyone connected to the manor. Financial collapse in this world was a public event, visible in stages, long before any final conclusion arrived. The creditors who held these debts were not without leverage, but their position was more precarious than the sums they were owed might suggest. Jewish lenders faced a fundamental structural vulnerability. Their right to operate depended entirely on royal protection, an arrangement that could be altered or withdrawn at the king's discretion. Kings extracted revenue from Jewish communities through taxation, forced contributions, and levies that bore no proportional relationship to what those communities had lent or earned. When a lord was unwilling or unable to repay, his options were considerable. He could appeal to prevailing sentiment against Jewish lending. He could bring accusations against a creditor through channels that favored a nobleman's social and feudal standing. He could simply wait for a shift in royal policy. The creditor held a legal instrument. He did not hold a political network. Italian merchant lenders operated with more sophisticated legal tools and could threaten to withdraw credit arrangements, affecting a broader range of borrowers, a form of indirect leverage. But they too depended on secular and ecclesiastical authorities to enforce contracts, and those authorities were not disinterested parties. Consider the position of a creditor holding an unpaid debt against a lord of some standing. The legal instruments are clear. The debt is documented. But pressing for repayment risks antagonizing a man whose feudal connections and social standing the creditor cannot match. Waiting costs money. Acting costs relationships. The creditor calculates and waits. This asymmetry, legally strong but socially and politically exposed, defined the creditor's position throughout these dealings. When a lord's finances deteriorated far enough, the effects did not remain confined to him. They moved downward through every layer of the manor's life. A lord was not only an authority who collected dues. He resolved disputes between tenants, enforced customary rights, and provided military protection. He was the legal identity of the manor in its dealings with the outside world, with neighboring lords, royal officials, and church courts. When that function weakened, the people beneath him lost a functional layer of their world, not merely a symbolic one. For the peasants and serfs who worked the land, a weakened lord created immediate practical problems. Uncertainty arose about who held authority and whose rules applied. Creditors or rivals moving into positions of influence introduced new claims that disrupted established arrangements. A tenant who needed a dispute settled, or who sought to assert a customary right, had fewer guarantees than before. The church's presence on the manor was affected as well. Local chapels and the clergy attached to them often depended on the lord's patronage for the maintenance of buildings, the payment of priests, and the support of regular religious observance. When that patronage weakened, the administrative fabric of religious life on the manor frayed. But the consequences extended beyond the institutional. The rhythms of worship and observance that structured daily existence for ordinary people could be disrupted when the material support sustaining them was no longer reliable. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, and mills required ongoing investment to remain functional. A lord who could no longer fund that maintenance allowed the physical infrastructure of the manor to deteriorate. This was not an abstract concern. It affected harvests, movement, trade, and the basic conditions of survival on the land. A lord facing financial collapse had options. None of them were without cost. The first was marriage. Negotiating a union with a wealthier family, including merchant or rising bourgeois families, could bring capital into the estate, but marrying below one's rank was a visible concession, legible to peers and rivals. It was a transaction dressed in social ritual. Both parties understood what was being exchanged. The second was military service. Joining a royal campaign or a crusade offered the possibility of plunder, the ransom of captured knights, and royal favor. It was high risk. A lord who returned without gains was worse off than before, and a lord who died left his estate without leadership. But military service was socially acceptable in a way that other forms of income-seeking were not. It aligned with noble identity. The third was an appeal to the king. A lord could seek royal relief, favor, or direct financial support. This always came at a political price: greater loyalty obligations, forced service, or the surrender of certain autonomous rights. Recovery through royal intervention meant trading financial survival for political independence. The fourth option was the sale or permanent pledge of land. Selling parcels outright or pledging them permanently to creditors was the most damaging path. Once land left a family, it rarely returned. It marked the beginning of structural decline for a noble line. For those who could not recover by any of these means, the conclusion was terminal. The manor passed to a creditor, was absorbed by a rival lord, or esceaded to the crown. The lord became a landless knight, still noble in rank, but without the material foundation that rank required to function. There is one further dimension worth noting. The expulsions of Jewish communities from England in 1290 and from France in 1306 were complex political events shaped by multiple forces. But one documented consequence was economic. Widespread noble debts to Jewish lenders were effectively cancelled when those communities were removed. This was not the cause of these expulsions, but it was a recognized outcome, and it relieved indebted nobles of obligations they could not otherwise have discharged. It is a documented pattern, one dimension of decisions that served multiple interests simultaneously. The financial life of a medieval lord was not separate from the political order he inhabited. It ran through it. It sustained it, and when it failed, it destabilized everything connected to it. A lord's financial collapse was never simply a private misfortune. It was simultaneously a political failure, a social failure, and a material failure for every person within his sphere, from the retainer who lost his wages to the tenant whose disputes went unresolved, to the parishioner whose chapel fell into disrepair. The fundamental fragility was structural. Social obligations were high and largely fixed. Income was slow, seasonal, and uncertain. There was no mechanism capable of absorbing sustained financial pressure without consequence. In the medieval world, power was not self-sustaining. It required constant material maintenance. Rank alone, without the resources to perform it, held nothing together.